Ohayo gozaimasu. This is the Curse Discussions podcast. I am Chucky R. Law. Today with me is Mr. Zog. We got up really early for this episode, so you better fucking listen to it. So today we wanted to discuss the merits, the likelihood, the strategies behind secession, and things to watch internationally, things to watch within the U.S. for, secessionist movements, the ideology of pan-secessionism, to what extent libertarians should endorse it, all that good stuff. So I think one of the first topics that we should cover when we're talking about this is, this is sort of newsworthy recently, the Three Californias initiative, which is derivative of the earlier Six Californias initiative. If you remember, this was a few years back. There was a proposal to break California up into 6 states. It didn't ever quite go anywhere, and this was because a lot of liberals were accusing conservatives of being behind the proposal and wanting to break California up so they could get more representatives for themselves from West California or East California and stuff like that. And this new proposal is quickly gathering signatures, and I think it might actually get enough to be on the ballot here. The other one did as well, but a lot of the signatures were actually discounted. Do you have an opinion on that, Mr. Zog? What do you think? Do you think it's a good thing, or do you think it might... should we be rooting for this as libertarians?
I mean, I can't really find any strategic reason not to, because breaking up that fucking wasteland that is California is a universal good. The serious answer is that it was intended to better represent demographics in these various areas, and a lot of, even when you talk about secession to other people, what a lot of people do is they'll sacralize the states, the 50 states in the Union, even though most of them are just, geographic constructs. They don't really represent anything more than that. And California is pretty much like that. I mean, remember when California was first admitted into the Union, it didn't have nearly as many people as it does now. It was one of the least populated states in the Union. And even today, the differences and interests of people in San Francisco and conservatives in the suburbs is so drastically different that you need widely varying representatives. And yeah, breaking them probably into 3 wouldn't even be enough. I do think around about 5 or 6 would be, I'd say that's be appropriate. The only argument against it I could find is that one group would dominate, though, and that's bad for some reason, because they have an unquestioned majority, even though a bunch of shitlibs in San Francisco have very little to do with people in the East, and they aren't going to move to each other, so you question why not. It's, the people who want to leave should move within 10 years, and if they don't, well, it's a small price to pay. I think moving, demographics who are stuck and are now a minority in certain places, is one of those things that people who are against secession will always whine about, but I don't think that's a tactical problem when you compare the alternative.
I mean, I think in the case of mere secession of a state and still within the overarching U.S. system, I don't think that we probably wouldn't see a lot of people moving as a result of that, although you might see it a little bit depending on how dramatic the change in political climate was as a result of the secession. However, that kind of brings me to a point which, I generally agree with basically what you said about that, and I think that it's probably reasonable for libertarians to be rooting for this Three Californias thing. But I'll say this: I think that we talk about how it's not a good idea to sacralize when we're looking at secessionist plans, the particular boundaries of the U.S. I would say, though, that if we're talking about practical secession, if we're talking about what is most likely to actually happen, it probably would have to do with actual states, right? As opposed to something like, oh, we're gonna secede and form, like I don't know, what was that one Ryan made, the fucking Lakota state, or something like that. I mean, I guess, or the Christian state around. Like, I feel like it's a lot more likely that we would see something like Alaska as a state, although which he did give, in fairness, as a particularist movement, or even California as a state. I think that's more likely than we see the progressive states of America ever seceding, right? And so I think that one concern might be that if you divide California into three, that's going to weaken the Yes California movement, which also has surprisingly gained a significant amount of traction. It's sort of interesting that you've got sort of these different solutions to the California question, which I guess has become a thing for normies now, which is somewhat exciting. With some people wanting to break it up within the U.S. and some people wanting it to leave the U.S. entirely. Now, to be fair, I think the U.S. federal government would, I would probably consider it a disaster, right? If California ever were to leave, even a Republican administration, even it would be good for them electorally, right? But just the amount of not resources, but the amount of like economic infrastructure that's there. You have Hollywood. That's a huge cultural force in America. I think that the federal government would be very reluctant to let them go. However, that being said, I'm not sure what would actually happen if they were to vote to leave. I don't know if the government would try to hold them by force or what.
I'm gonna go with your first point there about breaking up the. If we would break up California into like 3 states, you could object to it on the grounds of it would weaken the independence movement. I don't think that's actually true, because I think the only people in California that actively support secession enough to vote for the California National Party are like San Franciscans and like a dozen or so conservatives in the suburbs. I don't think it's nearly strong enough the more east you go, because everyone who believes in an independent California nation sadly is a fucking prog. So I don't think that would be true, but I don't think that's one of the things people will hang up on when they talk about secession. Oh, is the government going to invade? And I don't think that the answer is yes. I think it's pretty decisively if there was enough demand to secede, and they demand, you have X and Y votes from these towns and shit. I don't think the government could say no. I mean, they could, obviously they could just send in the National Guard and violently crush it, but that would look like terrible in the international community. So maybe if they were, the fucking panhandle in Oklahoma wants to, tell the feds to fuck off, they could probably crush that, but I don't think they would actually crush, like, Texas seceding or something like that. That's just sounds very impractical and like a disaster for the administration.
Well, I mean, that would be what I would hope as well, but, the lesson I've learned from the recent Catalonia stuff is that sometimes you can just kind of get away with it, right? At least in the short term, right? Because what we saw there was very clear, right? Like, the people of Catalonia voted to secede from Spain. The Spanish just sent in the police to beat the fuck out of them. And, then the international community was fine with it.
Yeah, but Catalonians don't have guns. We do.
Oh, well, sure, but I don't think that, if they had shot back or something, if they had, started shooting at the police, I don't think that would have, made it any better for them. I mean, if we're talking about the possibility of actually winning a war, then I don't know, like, perhaps California could wear the U.S. down, or Catalonia could wear Spain down in a war. But I don't think that there's like a lot of willingness to really do that in either case.
Right. That's why I don't think war would ever happen. Either the U.S. would, I think if the U.S. could crush them reliably using only like the state's National Guard in like 3 months, then maybe. But war, I don't think the U.S. would ever bother war and just invade some. We formed a fucking the Deseret Empire. Now, the U.S. isn't really going to invade that, even if it's like a theocracy. Who gives a shit, right? Some fucking, like, hick from Georgia who goes through logs of coke does not care about Deseret or keeping it in the Union.
I
No
don't
one
know
thinks
about
like
that. I
that.
think that, like, most likely that hick from Georgia is probably a Trumpanzee, probably someone who is really into the.
Right. But what I'm saying is they don't care enough for war. They want it to stay in the Union, but I don't think they give that much of a shit.
I think they do care enough for war. I think you're probably mistaken about that. I think they care enough about, here's their standard for going to war. They'll go to war if they, the news tells them that, like, some Muslim is being mean or something. They'll be like, bomb them. We need to bomb the hell out of them. You think they're gonna tolerate it if, like, the fucking shit libs want to secede in California? No, they're gonna be like, bomb the hell out of them.
Oh yeah, with California, yeah, probably right. I'm talking about anything that isn't California. Like if Texas tried to secede, I don't think there would be. I think honestly, it just depends on what kind of states wants to secede.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. If it's something that seems conservative, Texas, I think that the conservative movement would be about split on it, and I think that but the left would be probably almost unanimously opposed, with maybe a few people saying let him go.
The left would cross their arms and say, "Well, we can't do that," but they wouldn't really care enough. The thing about war, well, I think California is a weird example because I think if let's say we got these like 3 shitholes in California, like you could have the cities of San Francisco and Los Angeles declare their independence, and just those could be like functional city states, right? I think the rest of it, I think if you remove those, like you could remove the top 5 cities from California, and like everything else would be, we could stay in the Union, I guess, because, well, I don't like it. Most secessionist sentiment in California is progs. So I don't think
that kind of brings up the point that you were making earlier about this, right? And this is something I feel should be pointed out, is that you're talking about how if California was split up into 3 or 6 or whatever, it probably wouldn't harm the secessionist movement, considering that most of the secessionists are, the harder core progressives who live in a geographically concentrated region anyway. But I would kind of disagree with that, because I think that even if it's the case that most of the people who want to secede from the United States who live in California live in, like, I don't know, the valley or whatever the fuck it is. I don't know California's geography. Even if that's the case, I think they'd be much more likely to support secession if they felt like they had a wider area which would be more viable as an independent country, as opposed to, a really small area. They'd be more reluctant to leave the U.S. And also, I think that if you kind of split up California, that sort of harms the California identity a little bit. And I think California has one of the stronger identities in the U.S., right? There's certain states that are more likely to have, they got California Republic or whatever. Like Texas has that really strong. Vermont has that, right? But I think that California is one of those states, and so part of the reason why there's a secessionist movement there in California, as opposed to, say, a strong secessionist movement in, like, the Northeast, like in say Maine. I mean, or not Maine, like, say, like Massachusetts. Massachusetts is really shit libby too, right? They also really don't like Trump, but it doesn't have nearly as strong of a unique independent identity as California, and that's why we're not seeing any kind of Yes Massachusetts campaign, right? And I think that it might harm that identity and therefore make secession less likely if we were to split the state up, in addition to just it being less of a viable country.
I would argue the political representation that comes from splitting them up into 3 or whatever however you want to divide that up, different states would ultimately be better, because that's getting voted. That's gathering signatures, and secession isn't. It's just more politically viable. I don't think the identity of a Californian identity is strong enough in an actual political perspective. Like, oh, Californians will wear Bear Republic shirts and all that kind of shit. But I don't think it's strong enough. I think it depends on if you ask your average Californian, would you die for an independent Californian republic? Most of the answers would be no, because they don't
most
really.
of them wouldn't die for it, and most of them wouldn't vote for it either. But there's a larger subsection of them that would vote for it, but who would not die.
But I have a problem with the idea of state identity because it doesn't really exist. Like, it's like with Texas. Texan identity. Well, Texan and Californian identities do technically exist, but it's not in the current borders. Like.
Sure.
Like Dallas and Austin are not. I mean, Dallas at least certainly isn't Texan, and Austin is not Texan. Everything in the Northeast is Anglophonic Texan. Everything like fucking what's that insanely Hispanic city on the border? Like, my mind's drawing a fucking blank, but that's not Texas, right? That's just having to falls within Texas borders.
Yeah. No, I agree.
I think if you were to divide like Texas even into like three states, a really Hispanic one, a middle one, and a northeastern, I think that northeastern one would probably have a higher chance of secession than this fucking Texas, for example, because you'd concentrate most of the people who like it.
I'm not sure. I feel like that might be. It would depend on the context of the secession, right? I mean, if the like Hispanic state was like if the Texas state was like called Texas and the other ones weren't, if somehow that Texas identity was the strongest, I mean, I don't know. It'd be hard, right? Like to dissolve Texas into its like constituent parts. I think it would have to. One of them would have to, like, within the context of that partition, would have to clearly be like known as the Texas, right? And if that's the case, maybe you're right. Does that make sense? You kind of know what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying, but it just happens to deal with the fact that pretty much all states are pretty much just geographical constructs. They aren't really based on any like concise demographics. You can find like one or two. Like there's no real sense of like balkanizing Hawaii, for example, but that's a special case. Like you could divide Texas on demographic grounds, and it just really works. The only argument I guess that I could find is like an unintended consequences thing, like you're talking about. But I don't think secession is likely enough in the current political climate that becomes reasonable. I'd argue that once most people got a taste of the kind of like partitioning their state in like three different ones, they'd probably be more favorable towards independence. And if they aren't, they'd still be living under a way more representative political organization.
Okay.
That it reaches a point to where, I mean, yeah, you could probably end up to a point where they become your average like fucking Californian settler unionist, but I don't think that would happen. I think that such a risk is so low. It's whatever.
All right, well, let's move on to a different topic. So, we've talked before about the All Nations Party, which I guess is something that Ryan was LARPing about a few years ago. That's kind of funny, pretending he had a party. But if something similar to that actually existed, I'm wondering how viable it would be, or how it would actually function mechanically in the current U.S. political system, right? Because the U.S. is sort of interesting, right? It's got a presidential system. It doesn't have a parliament. So I think that makes something like a federation of local parties a little bit more difficult to achieve, right? Because you can't really have like coalitions as easily. But I mean, I don't know. Someone would have to come up with a way for that to actually work electorally. I mean, I guess what you could do is just have, whatever the Libertarian Party, the Black Party, the White Party, whatever, like
You're
voted
talking
for
about
locally,
like
but have their candidates declare themselves to be for
so
the All
just
Nations Party.
basically like the caucus system.
Yeah.
In the current U.S. political climate, like an insanely identity-based one, probably not. No, I don't think you could do one of those reliably and not get called racist because you have,
Well, why is if the U.S. system you're saying is insanely identity-based? Why would that make it less likely that this would work?
I'm saying making an identity-based party is less likely because the current U.S. political climate is so against the idea. I'm not saying the current climate is very identity-based. I'm saying the current U.S. climate is very anti-identity. That you couldn't, if let's say if there's a fucking, an all nations party and they have like 20 different candidates who run for various groups, like there's a guy who wants to, form a state for blacks, like in like northern, like basically Atlanta, and then there's another guy who wants to fucking like federate the Midwest into some Native American LARP. Those guys would be, slandered, and it would depend on who it was. Like some guy who advocated for a white state in the Pacific Northwest would basically be crucified, and the guy who's like trying to LARP as Malcolm X would, be less so. But you'd still face a really big amount of backlash for this.
Oh, for sure you would.
I don't know how much that would matter to the people who actually vote for you.
I don't think that I don't think that the time is right for something like that either. But what I'm wondering is not more like, okay, so supposing that people were more inclined towards pan-secessionism, or for whatever reason ideologically, how do you think it would work electorally, having such a party trying to compete with the Republicans and the Democrats?
That depends. Where do you? Let's see. That's a really hard question to answer because I'm tempted to say it wouldn't make any big inroads. It would take like 20 years to build up any base of support. But I think you could run it if you could run it in like where are you running it? What kind of strategy are you going with? Who's the candidate? Yeah. But if you tell me value neutral, if the basically a secessionist forum more than anything. If you were running one of those candidates in like Illinois, it'd probably be dead on arrival. But if you ran it in like some like Texan villages, it'd probably be more appealing. I think long term, a big pan-secession forum would exist as like a gathering, pretty much like the alliance of democratic national parties, like shit like that. You know how around the world there's those big conglomerations of like 100 different parties?
Yeah, but that's kind of my point, is that those typically exist in parliamentary systems where it's easier to do that.
No, they don't. They can pretty much consist of anything.
I guess the biggest analogy in the U.S. is, so the Democrats and the Republicans and other parties as well, sort of, if we go back to like the 19th century and earlier, they used to be less ideological and more kind of federations of different local interests, right? Like you had, I know in the late 19th century, the Republicans were sort of an alliance of basically like Midwestern, like German farmers and shit, and
that's more of a coincidence in tribalism, like certain groups for certain parties, yeah, but that's gonna happen. Sort of that's gonna happen with literally any party though.
Voting and stuff today too, to some extent, obviously. I mean, well, not to to a significant degree, right? But it was more explicit back then. I think they didn't pretend as much to have like a unifying ideology, and they were more just explicitly like alliances of different local interests. But
I think that you're right. They were more explicit, but they weren't. But they're not any less implicit, right? There's a reason, alt-righters will
What
say,
does
"Oh,
that
the
mean?
the Republicans are, the party of white people, and the Dems are the party of, various minorities." Like Republicans implicitly serve white interests because like the alternative is some Dem in fucking New York letting in a 30 Gorillion immigrants and fucking everything up. Like it's implicitly white identity politics, and they implicitly allow it. And they're not going to come out and say, well, they can't do that anymore because it would kill like most of their voter base, because people pretty subconsciously vote in their racial interest even if they don't want to think they do. I don't think it's any more implicitly or any less implicitly tribalist than it was back then. It's just less explicit. Like back in the day, you could have like the Know Nothing Party and a bunch of other coconut babu parties, and you could say proudly on like a banner, "We hate niggers." You can't do that.
That's not my point, though. I'm not saying that the U.S. is less tribal, although I'm not sure I would actually agree with like the extent of your characterization of like. I mean, well, I'll say this: I think that the racialization of the U.S. parties has been accelerating in recent years, but it wasn't. It wasn't always that way, right? Like even if we go back, I mean, obviously the Republicans have had for quite a while, like
Wait. You're arguing that like back in the day it wasn't as racially based.
for sure. I mean, one example of that would be like Asians used to vote Republican
I
until
mean,
about 2000, as did
the,
as did
the
Middle Eastern groups, right? Like so it wasn't like now. I would say the Republican Party is increasingly looking like the party of white people, as you put it. But I mean, you can go back and and find like other minority groups who used to vote Republican who are increasingly like less leaning towards Republican, and Hispanics obviously were always Democrat leaning, but they were used to be sort of substantially less Democrat leaning than they are now.
like I mean that's Hispanics voting Democrats. One of those you could talk about that like for 5 hours, because that's a very fractured history. But like I disagree with the idea that they were a whole lot less racially based, because I mean, especially for the Dems, they banked fucking hard on the idea that they were the white man's party, especially like the first.
Oh no! I'm not talking about. When I say back in the day, or well, I didn't say back in the day.
Like
But
how old are we
I'm not
talking?
talking
Like
about that far back, right? I'm talking about like so. I'm saying that the parties have become increasingly racialized within the last several electoral cycles, like presidential elections. So, say, since around the time of like like Reagan and George H.W. Bush and people like that, like Clinton. Since
so
about
like so
then,
like
the
if
parties have
you
become more racialized.
when were they the least racialized? Do you think?
Oh,
Then
I'm not really sure.
because I just don't think that they were ever. I mean, there were like periods like
I
Reagan,
mean, like, would you
that
disagree with what I just said, that they have become more racialized since then? I think that would be kind of hard to argue with.
yeah, I definitely agree with that, but I don't think they were ever. I don't think people ever voted based on their ideological conscience or that
Oh
bullshit.
no, no, I
I
don't
don't
think
agree
so.
with that.
No.
But I'm saying that they had always been like this. I'm saying that they were probably
Well,
more.
okay, the specific. So I think that so people vote as a rule based on tribal factors, right, rather than based on ideology. We know this from looking at polling of people who, I mean, one example of this. This is the most extreme thing. Is there's according to polling, even black people who literally hold the opinion that the Republican Party not only is better for the country in general, but is specifically better for black people,
Right, they
will
vote for
still on
Democrat.
average vote for Democrats, right? So they and that's kind of a weird thing too, because that sort of implies that it's not necessarily like group interests as much it is group identity, right? Where they must feel some sort of like that like they're being a cuck or being bad. I mean, whatever they feel like they have a strong like group aversion to voting Republican, even if they think it might have been a good idea. And you could see the same sort of for some certain, rural, poorer whites who vote Republican, even though if you look at the polling data on certain issues, they align more closely with the Democrats, right? They're populists basically. They don't give a shit about like cutting taxes for the rich. Ooh, that's always funny to see like shitlibs getting triggered about that. They're voting against their own interests. That always triggered me quite a bit. This is going on a tangent now. But, Democrats talking about, people are voting against their own interests. Like,
Right.
Do you not know Rawls? He's your own fucking great philosopher, you, like, shitlib piece of fucking shit. You're supposed to vote against your own... You're supposed to vote for what you think is best for the country. You're not supposed to vote for your own interests, you naked, like, tribalist fuck.
Like the whole point of post-racial democracy is that we have to keep America safe. We have to vote in her interests. Like it was never about group Y doesn't like group X. Like ultimately, I like tribal politics because I think it's better in multiracial quad democracy. But like you want to really take that hard, we end up with like a situation in Africa where you have some illiterate militiamen banging down your door because you don't belong to President Garba Bagalu's tribe.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, too, though, to make the point that I was going for. So I don't think that it's that politics has become, like, any more tribal overall, although perhaps it has. I'm not really sure about that. But I think that... just the point I was making is that the Republican Party has become whiter, right? And the statistics speak for themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely
and
true.
The Democratic Party has become less white.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. As a whole, I don't. No, I wouldn't disagree with that. Yeah, the statistics are certainly true. I mean, there's no denying it that Republicans, the Republican Party. I wouldn't say like white people are becoming more Republican, but the Republican Party is certainly way more white than it was,
white
30
people
years
are
ago.
Becoming more Republican. That's true.
I mean, they're becoming more conservative, but that's just generational.
The Republicans are winning the white vote by a wider margin. Although, what's interesting is that in the last election, I mean, Donald Trump was a fairly bad candidate electorally. He ended up doing worse among college-educated whites, but obviously significantly better among non-college educated whites.
I feel like that statistic just exists so some guy with an African studies degree can feel good about himself because he voted for Bernie.
Yeah, sure.
But
overall, whites have increasingly been voting Republican.
I guess that's true. Probably right. It's one of those things I haven't looked up statistics for because I look more to like group political consciousness rather than what they voted for the blue tribe or the red tribe.
That's actually part of something that's caused like why the electoral impact of the like demographic shift towards Hispanics has not been as dramatic as some people have predicted. Right? Is because in certain states where like you've seen a lot of Hispanic immigration, like the Southwest or whatever, the increase in Hispanics has sort of been compensated for by basically the whites who lived in those states becoming more conservative, and so they haven't gone as blue as you might have expected. Now,
I don't know if that'll keep up with current immigration trends, but
well, no, obviously, that wouldn't continue indefinitely if you had more and more Hispanics. However, it is also the case that the tide of Hispanic immigration now is stemmed a bit. Although the demographic shift continues, but that's mostly a function of differing birth rates, and the differing birth rates are also closing currently. The Hispanic fertility, although currently above whites, is now falling.
Yeah, that just depends if it's going to keep up with immigration. Because Hispanics, on average, seem to have lower kids as time goes on. Really that's true with every single group. I don't think there's any group. I don't think there's a single group that actually, like, the more generations you have, the less kids you have. This is universally true. I don't think there's any group that does not follow this trend.
That's sort of an interesting phenomenon just demographically in itself, right? Like the idea of
well, the thing about it is because a lot of these people come from like second and third world countries, and I guess after like 3 generations, it gets into their head, oh, I should stop having 20 fucking kids that I can't pay for.
Right. There's different factors but like what seems to underlie them, at least to me, is sort of basically just abundance, right? Is that for whatever reason, whatever the mechanics of that are, the longer people live in abundance, the less, like, they just reproduce less. And also I think that's tied to more liberal social attitudes as well that seem to come about in situations of abundance.
I mean, it's kind of hard to have kids when you're killing them all, but yeah, as society becomes more, I guess, technologically advanced, you will have less kids because there's less need to have them, and you don't need to have 20 of them because they live more than 35.
And of course, this affects different populations at different rates, right? Because we've got, for example, like Africans right now, they're having, one of the reasons we're going to see a population explosion in Africa is because, they're sort of behind the curve. But as they catch up,
what's going to happen is, you see this in like Pakistan and India. The worst period for a nation is when it's developing, but it's not. It's getting to be a semi-developed nation like Mexico. Like not Mexico. I would say like most of the Slavic countries would fall into this banner of what I call 7-10 developed nations. They're industrialized and developed, but they're held back by some crippling problem, right? They're like crippling economic problem. That's the bit before that is the worst part because they have enough resources.
What do you mean by worst part?
For population growth, because it's too explosive. They have enough kids that where they can sustain them, but it's they don't have enough to. It's not sustainable long term. Like, Pajit can have 20 kids, but instead of half of them dying out from rabies or the fuck, they live just long enough to fuck everything up.
They get into, they still have the mentality of like having like tons of kids where they don't like die in like infancy or whatever, but now they actually survive.
Right, births don't become eugenic yet.
But eventually, like,
that's the thing.
Their behavior sort of shifts to adapt to this scenario.
This thing with generations, right?
Adapt to the economic situation.
Let's talk about the base Arab Christian immigrant. He has 10 kids because half of them are gonna get slaughtered in the Middle East. But he stops having them as progressively as generations as by the time his grandkids. Well, by the time his great grandkids roll around, they have like 2 kids because it's finally gotten in their head that they need to stop breeding like fucking rabbits.
Sure.
I think it's very, very generational, very, very generational. That's why you have a bunch of, aging fucking GI generation people who are like nearly all dead and they're all whining because, they're like Gen X, great grandchildren don't have 30 kids because they didn't need them.
So to kind of bring this back to secession, I think that's interesting in terms of like how demographic shifts affect secession, particularly internationally. I know that like demographic shifts were, for example, like a drive. This isn't exactly secession, but were a driving force in the decolonization movements in South Africa and Rhodesia, for example.
I'm almost stop you right there. So you're arguing that secession movements were tied.
I'm sorry, this is not exactly secession, but the decolonization movement in South Africa and Rhodesia was propelled very significantly by a shift in demographics, and I think that it works the same way to a significant degree with secession, right? I mean, one example of that that's in the current day would, I guess, be Northern Ireland, where Catholics are reproducing faster than Protestants, and obviously, they are more likely to favor seceding from the UK and rejoining the Republic of Ireland, Chucky Arla. But Protestants are breeding slower, and they're the stalwarts who want to stay in the UK. So there's geopolitical implications for secession there.
The geopolitical ramification for Ulster would be to just say fuck it and just make it its independent nation. That's the best solution, but
Ulster nationalism. I don't know. I don't know if we want to get too far into the Irish question right now. I have very strong opinions about that, but I think that sort of deserves its own episode, actually.
Do a whole thing on that. So, a little side note, though, the guy who ran what was called the Ulster Home, it was the only real movement that was in favor of an Ulster Republic. He was he was an American, but he had an American wife, I think it was, and she apparently got him really into neo-Confederate literature, and that was his inspiration. It was some weird stuff.
This?
Oh fuck, dude! I could not tell you his name. He was, I think he's basically like a fascist now. So maybe that would feed into
the alliance between the Confederacy.
What's his name?
Ulstermen and Israel.
It's something I'd have to look up, dude. I really don't remember his name.
Okay, but anyway,
the decolonization movement.
I don't know. That was just an interesting point about I don't know how interesting it was, but that was a point about how demographics might affect secession, right? And we can even talk about this within the United States as well, right? I mean, obviously, as the alt-right, constantly talks about, the U.S. is becoming less white, for example. So I think that does, that does lend more credence to the creation of ethno-nationalist states within the U.S., although it still is quite unlikely.
Yeah, basically. But what was the point I wanted to make about this? The fucking demographic shifts in certain areas is interesting because I don't. It depends on how ethno-nationalist the secession movement was. If you want to argue, you're arguing that demographics affect secession movements, and that's true. But I think it depends on how much you actually built your secession movement on. Oh, dude, we're all white, dude. Like a bunch of spics moving into the Pacific Northwest don't give a shit about Cascadia, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think it depends on what Cascadia was built on, right? I think they potentially could if it was if Cascadia was a white nationalist project, right? Then I think that they would probably be, not only would they not give a shit, they'd be actively opposed to it. But if it wasn't, I don't necessarily think that they would be against it. Although maybe they would a little bit, since Hispanics tend to, and a lot of these low information political actors, or who tend to be poorer, a lot of times minorities.
They have high time.
I've noticed they sort of tend to be a bit of a reactionary force, right? Where they sort of default to the status quo, supporting the status quo, or maybe something a little bit to the welfare side of the status quo. But that's sort of how it works with the bread and circus. I mean, just for example, how Hispanics supported Clinton over Sanders in the Democratic primary. Right. I think that it maybe for some of the same reasons they might, even if Cascadia was not a white nationalist project, it was just a neutral, or even maybe a progressive movement to secede from the U.S. I think Hispanics might be a little bit hesitant to get on board. I think though that could be counteracted if they were seceding in Atzlan or whatever, you know, like if it was an explicitly Hispanic ethno-nationalist state, I think they'd be more
Hmm.
friendly to that.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, you have a yeah. That was a funny idea, but you could argue about the. I would argue frequently the validity of a spic state, as I call it, in the areas where they have like such a strong demographic presence. But states like that would be kind of hard to maintain for what I hope are obvious reasons that I won't go into because it's way too complicated and long. Um, the
Ooh,
idea
you
with
tease.
yeah, the thing about it's like I said, how much you build your movement on ethno nationalism, and I think like you'd probably have, for example, some white people who'd support Atslan, where the fuck, because they would like maybe you'd have some really autistic libertarians who think it would like lead to greater political decentralization, but I don't think that's strong enough to even warrant like even vague consideration. Really, the people whose opinions on
Oh, you don't
secession
think so?
matter. No, I really don't think
Are you?
so.
But are you not in favor of Atzlan or whatever leaving the U.S.?
Yes, but that doesn't mean I actually advocate for it though. It's like
I'm confused.
I think there's a difference between saying yeah you should do that and actual advocacy. I think there's a difference between the thing. That sounds like some new speak shit, but it really isn't. Like I don't advocate for fucking like
So you're saying
NRX.
you're more or less indifferent to it, but if it happened, you'd be fine with it?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't care enough to say you guys should
Okay,
totally form
that's
like
interesting
a
because there sort of is like a general rightist, libertarian sort of tendency where people actively sort of agitate for not only states that they would want to live in, but other states as well to secede. I mean, for example, like this is like I don't know how exactly this applies to Atslan or whatever, but I would, like, for example, probably be significantly in favor of the California leaving the U.S. Not because I'd want to live in an independent California, but because it would probably make the rest of the U.S. better. And I know, like, for example, there's people in the UK who live in England who are libertarians. I know who favor Scottish secession for similar reasons.
the. Let me think real quick.
Yeah.
Basically, the reason I wouldn't be, I'm not gonna go out and see tell a bunch of spics and all who live in shitty villages in the Rio Grande. I'm not gonna promote them seceding anywhere because of demographic reasons. Because I do think, really, my opinion on secession movements, I generally am a pan-secessionist. I support, some group Y asserting, their, right to autonomy and all that kind of shit. But it depends on how much I like them. I know it sounds kind of stupid and tribalistic, but the reason
No,
I don't think Atzlin is this universally great idea. If it
I think that
happened,
that's actually a very good point, right? And this is something that I try to bring up. This is sort of a reservation that I have about pan-secessionism as a libertarian, right? I think that a lot of times certain like libertarians, I think that there's a tendency in some circles to get it confused, like to think that it's a goal rather than a strategy, right? Whereas, in my
right, like
opinion, the goal of
here,
pansecessionism as a libertarian is not just like so we can have these like atrocidad, fucking,
you know, we
like
got the
Cascadia
fucking
or whatever it is. Like, I don't care about those states in themselves, but I would like eventually to use that as a vehicle to have a libertarian state somewhere in like New Hampshire or wherever, right?
right,
Um, so if we can exploit it
whenever
in that case, I'd be in favor of it. But I'm not super enthusiastic about, like, if there wasn't going to be a libertarian state, should we partition in the U.S.? I guess. I don't. I mean, but I'm not going to care as much. Sure, certainly.
right,
And I think too
like
that there are cases where secession can actually make things worse, right?
Like, yeah, we'll get into that in a second. The thing about what secession movements is, whenever you bring up secession, you'll have some guy who read the Agrist Manifesto once and say, well, you don't have any right to a state, and they're right, but it's they miss the point, right? Sure, no one has any right to a state, but they have the right to autonomy, and if X and Y brings even greater autonomy within a group, or even if they think it is, that's I would argue morally justifiable. It's
okay. See, here's the thing though, is that if you're talking about, you're saying that, like, okay, so a group would have more autonomy just by virtue of the fact that they if like, so suppose like a bunch of people are Democrats, right, and they all live geographically close to one another, and they all have some loose consensus on the policies of the Democratic platform. Okay, fine. If they secede from the U.S., they are more likely to, they all agree on these policies, but the thing is, they still don't consent necessarily to the state, right? And obviously, maybe it might be the case that if it was a small enough group, you could, go around and ask each one of them whether they like agreed to have the state, and they might all say yes. But then what happens? Maybe they wouldn't agree with specific stuff, and their rights would still be being violated in that case. But also, like, and somewhat more importantly, you would have obviously a minority of people who didn't want any to be involved in that at all, but just happen to live there. And I don't think that, like, as a libertarian, like, there's the meme to say, oh, we prioritize defending the smallest minority, who is the individual, and I sort of take that to heart here, right? Where, like, basically, the default norm is private property, individual freedom, individual autonomy, and it's not like establishing a state or whatever. So even if, suppose there's only like a small minority of people who like just do not want anything to do with this totalitarian hell state, I don't think it's better off for everyone if the majority in that area has more autonomy, so-called, to oppress the minority there, right? Like, it doesn't matter like if there's more of them, right? Because they're advocating for the bad thing, or for not. I mean, it is a bad thing, but it could be justified if everyone agreed to it. But if everyone agreed to it, if everyone doesn't agree to it, it's not any better just because they have a majority in that area. So I would object to, like, autonomy on those grounds. And I think that there are cases, like, the case that I usually like to bring up is like Syria. Okay, so Syria is ruled by sort of like a Alawite kind of upper crust who's sort of, they have a more moderate take on Islam. They're more Western, more progressive, you might say. And in this context, I do think progressivism is probably a good thing. But you have a majority who are sort of basically, sympathetic at least to Sunni fundamentalism, and they live more in the west the east of Syria, as opposed to the coastal regions. And I think that, like, imagine, suppose you were to have eastern Syria seceding and it just became like a theocratic Islamist shithole, right? Is that really better than just having, like, or it's like, say it's explicitly run by ISIS. Suppose ISIS makes the deal with Assad and they say, okay, we just want to own eastern Syria. We're not going to try and take over the whole country anymore. Assad says, okay. I don't think that's a better outcome than Assad just defeating them in a war and dominating them, and that therefore means that the whole country is more libertarian, has more individual rights, even if it's not the democratic will of the majority. I feel like there's, in these notions of national sovereignty, national autonomy, they're sort of baked in some sort of underlying sentiment of democracy, which I don't really agree with.
That's arguing that ISIS is a secession movement. That's a little.
No. I'm not arguing that ISIS is the secession movement. I'm hypothetically saying if it were a secession movement, which it very well could be, right? I mean, there's no reason why ISIS couldn't make a deal with Assad, like some sort of peace treaty, that very well could happen.
Mm, 3 years ago, you might have a point, but I don't
Okay,
really.
but you're missing the point. It's not. It's just about if this had happened, right? What should we do as libertarians? I think we should oppose it. But if you overvalue pan-secessionism, as I think some people do, then we should apparently support it.
The thing about
Really, I think that. Oh, go ahead.
I don't think that's ever been like a serious consideration though. The thing about states, I don't think states seceding to become more totalitarian isn't really like I've never been a very like I looked into this and I states that seceded and became more authoritarian than the states they seceded from. That's never been something that ever consistently happened, and whenever it did, it was for like a brief time, and they eventually liberalized whatever the fuck. I think. I mean, yeah, in a situation like that, you'd probably want the SAA probably telling them to eat shit, but I don't think that was ever been like a serious consideration to the point where it would work as a hypothetical.
Well, I
Just
mean,
feels
I think that
tortured.
there's okay. Well, one example of this. I mean, this is going to be pretty controversial, but other than free trade, I think the Confederacy was probably overall had worse laws and stuff than the Union. Now, in this particular case, I still would say it'd be better if the Confederacy had won, because I think it was sort of a unique situation where the Union had recently become worse, and I think Lincoln's brand of totalitarian federalism would have been discredited by losing the war. However, I think that's one easy case right there, where I think the Confederacy probably had more authoritarian, worse policies overall than the Union, other than free trade.
By 1860, like four, you'd probably be correct, but I think if no war happened, I don't think the CSA would have been that much more authoritarian. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
slavery, but
we can debate to what extent it was just sort of like necessary war measures or whatever, but I think that that's just a general, like that's just an easy like one-off example, right? Like I would be very,
no,
like
you can.
just the claim that it's so rare for like a state, why would it be rare for like a state to be worse, less libertarian than the one it secedes from? I think that that's pretty common in history. I like.
Right, but what I'm saying is that it's not authoritarian enough to justify some insanely, high casualty invasion, right?
Oh well, sure. Like you can
Like that's what I'm
debate. You
saying.
can
Like,
you can
sure,
debate about whether
let's say Scotland wants to secede from the UK, and they say we'll have X and Y policy that makes us a bit more authoritarian. I don't think that would justify the fucking British army invading and killing a bunch of people.
No. If there's going to be a war, that's one thing, right? But like if you can, I'm just saying, so you have to weigh the outcome against the means, right? Because I'm saying that it would be a better outcome if they don't secede, not that that justifies the means of having a war. Although I think it depends on how bad the war is, right? You could maybe have a war that was over very quickly, where not a lot of people died, where not a lot of property was destroyed. But anyway, I think we should say that I mostly would endorse pan-secessionism in democratic contexts, and I think less so in more authoritarian contexts. And the reason is because there's the basic argument for pan-secessionism that with somewhere like Scotland or California or Catalonia or whatever, if those regions are more left-leaning, right, then that makes the rest of the country probably more libertarian, right? Because you're getting rid of them electorally, and it's electoral boon for the rest of the country because you don't have to deal with those people anymore. However, in a context where you're not democratic in the first place, right, like such as in Syria, I don't think that really applies. I don't see any reason to support pan-secessionism in that case.
I'd probably agree with you if there was any serious attempt for that, but there isn't. But you brought up a good point that seceding will make the state you live in, more libertarian. I think that's one of the reasons a lot of people would say, oh yeah, dude, you should totally, California should totally secede, because you'd remove like their 50 or so, whatever the fuck kind of electors they get, because they have, the most amount of people in the union. I think that would be just a net good. I think that alone would actually justify secession.
Yeah, I mean, I support yes, California.
Like even if they get universal health care and it becomes a shithole to live in, it doesn't matter that much, right?
But again, my point is just that I think that really applies mainly to like democracies, but it doesn't really apply as much to like monarchies or dictatorships or whatever.
Probably.
Anyway, with that, do you have any final points? I think we're getting to that time to end the show here.
One final point I want to bring up is like pan-secessionism as it relates to political ideologies. Because when we were talking about Falk and his A&P earlier, a map he constantly drew up was splitting the U.S. along ideological lines. And it was like the Democratic States of America, the Republican States of America, there was like a libertarian covenant in like Vermont and northern Massachusetts. Stupid shit like that. And I think it's really stupid to consider that as like a serious thing. Like, think about political secession, like, along political lines, like, we're a political idea state. That's what I call them. The idea is very silly. Like, some fucking corn farmer from Iowa has very little to do with, some fucking factory, like a burnout factory worker from, like, Pennsylvania or the fuck. Like, you could say, oh, this, that Pennsylvania factory worker lives in, like, a Republican voting village, and the Iowan corn farmer who lives in, where the fuck Iowans live. That could fucking, they might have some vague interests because they vote for the red tribe, but overall you'd run into so many cultural conflicts that it would deteriorate within like 2 years. Like the fucking, like, blue tribe and red tribe have, when you look at the people who vote for them, it's completely out of convenience. People probably wouldn't vote for these people if, we weren't some, two-party diarchy. So forming these, massive states based off it seems insanely unstable and pretty much feels like it would collapse like the first sign of conflict. Like, you could form ethno-states and idea states, but you wouldn't remove conflict. And if you wanted to say, oh, this, let's say northeastern Vermont, most of Vermont, let's just say all of Vermont becomes like a Bernie Sanders ruled, he fucking instates a dictatorship, whatever the fuck, and he goes through all his dumb progressive policies, but maintaining a Vermontian state based on progressive policies is really unstable and doesn't actually ever seem to happen unless it's really specific. Like, people will say, oh, we should support, a neo-confederacy because it'll be, have certain political ideologies, but that's not why people secede usually. Unless it's something really specific, like Texans will cite, we're just being anti-federal because we want to secede, but in reality they bank upon cultural and economic reasons for their secessions.
Sure. I mean, as I said, like, I think that Ryan's stuff is a little bit, well, I don't want to say it's unrealistic, I mean, because obviously, but it's his disdain for like particularism in terms of like partitioning the U.S. on the basis of geographic or cultural stuff independent of ideology is a little bit, would make secession a little bit more tricky. But I do think that ideally it would be, secession would be based on political ideology a little bit more. But I think that if we were going to implement it, we would have to sort of mix it together. We want to make it as ideological as possible, but I think the more cultural we make it, the easier it's going to be to actually implement the secession. So I'm sort of a big brain centrist on that. But in any case, that, I guess, concludes our show. Once again, I've been Chucky R. Law. Today's Mr. Zog has been with me. Thanks for coming on. You can write us a discussion at write us an email at cursediscussions@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we will see you guys next time.
解放哎，这一份身当家做主人。